But for the exam, all you need to know is the simplest explanation is the best one. Let's turn from doctrine into talking about practice at the end of the Middle Ages. One of the things that becomes clear as you look at practices that were very popular and that were emphasized in the latter part of the Middle Ages, the end, a lot of Christians are involved in practices related to death and suffering. There's a lot of anxiety that people are feeling, and particularly anxiety about death. Right? We're talking the Black Plague, right? The famine, the warfare, the violence. There's so much going on in the latter part that we're talking about here that there is a culture of uncertainty, a culture of fear. And especially for the common people, there is this dread of what's going to happen. There were even reports of cannibalism. Right? So there's this widespread fear. This interest and focus on death and suffering showed up in Christian practice in a variety of ways. One way in artwork was the dance macabre. Especially in woodcuts, the dance of death became quite prominent. Death pictured as a skeleton leading his victims along, as a dancing skeleton. The message being, no one can escape death. Death is going to come for you. And usually in these woodcuts and in other expressions of the dance of death, there are people there from all stages of life, from all classes, and both genders. That in his dance, death comes for everybody. Usually also in the woodcut included an hourglass, right, suggesting your time is running out as well. So the dance of death becomes very prominent. Also prominent as a practice was interest in the sufferings of Jesus. Right? So it's not just death in general. There's fascination and meditation and practices related to the sufferings of Jesus. One of those is the Stations of the Cross, or the Via Crucis in Latin. A very popular devotion that developed during the latter Middle Ages. It combined physical movement with meditation. Usually within a cathedral or some other type of church structure, there would be a variety of stations spaced throughout the area related to events in the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, for a while, the number of stations varied depending upon what region you were in Europe, but eventually it was set at 14, so 14 stations. And in these stations was either a plaque or a painting or a sculpture related to different events in the life or in the movement of Jesus from his trial to his death. The idea being that you would move throughout the room, or in some cases maybe it would have been outside. You move along to each station, and at each station you meditate on the message of the cross and what that particular event in this journey means about Jesus and means about you. The early history of the Stations of the Cross is relatively obscure. Some people believe that it started in Jerusalem and then spread throughout Europe. That would make sense right? That pilgrims would develop a process or a practice in Jerusalem, trying to trace the last steps of Jesus as he moves from Pilate's council to the tomb. But eventually it does spread throughout Europe, and by the 17th century, it has been codified in 14 stations. You don't need to get these stations, but I do want to kind of go through them, give you an idea of what they are. And the artwork that is with them is more recent artwork. It's contemporary modern artwork. It's not from the time period. I couldn't find any pictures of stations from this time period. The first station is the condemnation of Jesus, right? So again, this is a more modern artwork relates to the station. Pilate washing his hands of Jesus' blood, Jesus taken by the soldiers after his condemnation. Now, one of the things, of course, that is encouraged in these places, right, in the participation in the Stations of the Cross, is the thinking about what this means. So, let's say, right, put yourself in the mindset here, in the Middle Ages. What kind of things do you think you would think about, or that you would be encouraged to think about as you stand at this first station, pondering Jesus being condemned to death? What would you think about?
The picture relates to civil marriage.
Okay. Very sterile academic answer.
What was the question?
So we're talking about the Stations of the Cross. And so you're in the Middle Ages, you're going through this, let's say, in a church sanctuary, and at the first station, you're encouraged to ponder about Jesus being condemned to death. What would you think about? Trish, you were going to.
Maybe the role that I potentially would have played.
Okay.
Bystander.
Yeah, would you have been one of those people calling for this to take place? Or would you have been one of the disciples on the outskirts, not really involved, but, how would you be in observing Jesus being sentenced to death? Other thoughts, other things that you think you might be?
I would like to think that, even today, I would be a person who stood up against it, I would stood against him being put to death, rather not against him, but,
Right.
Speaking out. That's what I would like to think. So,
Anything else that you would be, if you were going through these stations and you're here at this first station, Jesus is condemned to death?
I think, in a way that our generation reacted to the visual images of Passion of Christ, I think generations at that time, people at that time, would have probably reacted very similar way, because that was the highest definition of a visual image that you could give with these kinds of pictures. And so they might have the same sort of emotional reaction that we had when we watched the Passion. Awesome.
And really, the Passion is Passion of Christ is just Stations of the Cross. It's just a cinematic version of the Stations of the Cross. And so some of the things that you might have noticed in that, and you said, well, that's not biblical. Yeah, it's not biblical, but it's Stations of the Cross. And you'll probably notice here in a little bit. I won't ask you to do this on everyone, but these are the kind of things that a person will be encouraged to do, right? You're meditating on, or even things like, as Trish pointed out, right? You might be thinking about, where would I be in this? Would I be like Pilate? Would I be like the soldiers? Would I be like the crowd calling for his death? Or would I be somebody, on the outskirts? The full acceptance that Jesus has of this. In Gethsemane, he says, not my will, but thine be done. But, here he is allowing people to condemn him to death. Maybe that might be something that you would think about as well. The second station, the cross is laid upon him. Right? And so, again, these are modern pictures. That idea of Jesus taking the cross, right? The weight of maybe the crosses that we deserve might be something you think about.
These are modern pictures?
These are modern pictures. And so it's a modern artist that's done these. I couldn't find any from the Middle Ages. But this is some modern artist that's done this. The cross is laid upon him. Jesus, in the stations of the cross, falls 3 times. And so in each of these, you're kind of, might think about, just the weight of the cross upon him or the suffering that Jesus would be involved in. The 4th station is Jesus' encounter with his mother. Oh, not biblical, but it shows up in the Passion of Christ. All right? It's probably the one scene that really sticks out to me is when he tells her, "I'm making all things new," which of course is from Revelation, not from, and that idea. He's stumbled under his cross. Mary comes to him. That this is Jesus making things new. Simon the Cyrenian is made to carry the cross. What would you get to this station? What would you think about? What would you meditate upon?
How is that help him to?
I wonder if you would be willing to do that for somebody who's been punished, or would you be somebody out in the crowd mocking with the rest of them?
So you can see how this would mean something. It's still practiced by Catholics today, but you can see how this would, how you would connect, right, to the story, right, and the narrative, right, through this movement, through the meditation, the contemplation. Jesus' face, wiped by Veronica. In case you were wondering, what's the deal with this woman in the Passion of the Christ? Giving her, and then there's the face, taking the cross. Right? And so his face covered with blood. It's wiped by a woman named Veronica. The Catholic tradition, of course, connected with a woman with a hemorrhage. Right? So the woman with the hemorrhage touches Jesus. The robe and is healed. And so the tradition was this woman, Veronica, later named, is following there, and so she gives her veil to Christ to wipe the blood off of his face, and he returns it, now bearing the image of Jesus' face. It's kind of an early Shroud of Turin type of thing, right? It's not the same, there's no connection between this and the Shroud of Turin, but it's a similar type of thing about the image of Christ. The Shroud of Turin can only be traced as far back as the 14th century. And so it's unlikely that it is Jesus' burial cloth. But the same kind of idea. Jesus will fall again on station 7. Meets the women of Jerusalem in station 8. This is where he tells them not to weep for him, but weep for yourselves because of what is coming. Falls again at station 9. In station 10, Jesus is stripped of his garments to prepare for the crucifixion. What do you think you might think about at this station?
I know it's probably humiliating, first of all.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I would think about, is just the humiliation of this.
Yeah, it's humiliating. Not to mention that not only are people seeing, his entire body, but at this point his body is destroyed, and so also just his composure through all this, being humiliated, and I can't imagine the kind of pain. I'm sure his body was completely numb from the pain, but just all that combined, I think mentally, he still was focused,
even all this going on. Notice, I can't feel anything. I'm hurting, even though I can't feel anything. He was still focused and didn't lose that.
Well, think about the garment itself was probably dried stuck to his open wounds, and as it was ripped off of him, his wounds were reopened, and so he was putting even more pain.
Station 11 is the crucifixion. Station 12 is Jesus' death. Station 13 is the removal of Jesus' body, being taken down from the cross, usually depicted as being given to Mary. This is John, the apostle there with her. And then Station 14, he is laid in the tomb. And those are the stations of the cross. Now, part of me wants to say, you're missing the best part of that story. Don't stop there. There needs to be a 15th one. He comes back out. Right? But, as a practice that develops in the Middle Ages, right, so much is focused on the death and suffering, they are missing the best part of that story. But also, in a sense, you're kind of left there like the disciples would have been left there at the cross. And this kind of interminable wonder for the next however many hours they would have experienced that so what now moment. And in a sense, sermons and preachers have said these kind of things. We live on that Saturday between the crucifixion and the second coming. Right? And so in a sense, it makes sense why it's ending on Jesus being laid in his tomb, because we live in that moment between what we have as faith and what we'll have as sight. Stations 2, 3, 4, those are the cross, his first fall, his meeting with his mother. 6, Veronica. 7 is another fall, and then 14, laid in a tomb. Those seem to be the most common and the earliest ones. As I mentioned, there were some variations for a while. But eventually the number was set at 14. However, 5 of those stations are not in the Bible. The falls, Veronica, what's the other one? Yeah, the falls and Veronica. And the meeting of Mary along the way. Right? Mary's at the cross, but there's no indication on the way to the cross or on the way to Calvary that Mary encounters Jesus. In the 1990s, Pope John Paul II developed what was called the scriptural way of the cross, which was meant to be more in line with the narrative in the Bible, but it wasn't to replace the traditional one. Right? So both can be used. It starts with Jesus in the garden, and then being betrayed, condemned by the Sanhedrin, denial by Peter, and then includes some of the ones that we've talked about already, but also includes things like the promise of the kingdom to the thief. Right? Today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus entrusting Mary to John, right? And so that it's different, but it includes all of them are scriptural ones instead of some of the traditional ones.